One political issue that I worry about as I get older, you should, is assisted suicide. Don't go to the Netherlands. My daughter is a nurse with some pro-choice views, okay? So she's got some family issues. I don't want to burden her as I age, but I live in Oregon and I could see the culture moving in a direction of euthanasia. Do you care to comment on this? Is Henry from Portland, who's, I guess, keeping an eye on his pro-choice nurse?
Daughter, Henry, let me just give you a kind of an overview of what the bishops are thinking with respect to assisted suicide. The first thing to note is, yes, assisted suicide is an offense to the life of the elderly. You are quite right. I'm going to make another point in a second called assisted suicide creates a burden, creates a pressure to die on the elderly that they did not have previously, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The third thing is, yes, you are absolutely right, Henry. Assisted suicide does create a culture of death. It does open the path, to the acceptability and to the normative and moral acceptance of suicide within the culture, which does increase suicide rates, not just among elderly people, but among the young. This is really crucial. And the church, by the way, is worried about all three. I mean, the first, thing that's very, very important, for the church, and I'll just get to the main point. There's an old, principle that was articulated originally by John Locke and later by a guy named Baron de Montesquieu. But basically, the principle goes like this: you cannot give a freedom or an option to one group that will impose an onerous burden on another group. So in other words, every legislator, every judge, indeed, even in a plebiscite, a vote, right, that might take place, an initiative, you cannot, through that initiative process or through that legislative process, you can't create an onerous burden on one group in order to give a freedom to another group. As John Locke so playfully put it, right, my freedom to swing my arms around ends where your nose begins. So for all intents and purposes, then, we have to be exceedingly careful. Now, you might be thinking to yourself there, Henry, well, wait a minute, how does this put a burden to die on some group of people? Let me just give you three cases, and you can kind of contemplate on it. All of them come from Oregon, so I think you can get the message. One woman by the name of Kate Cheney, once the Oregon legislation had passed, her daughter went into her physician and asked for a prescription for assisted suicide. The doctor refused to give it to her, essentially because he knew very well that the mother did not want it and was probably psychologically incapable of making that decision. Furthermore, it was referred to a psychiatrist and a psychologist who both agreed the mother was not capable. It was then reviewed, given to another doctor. She went to another doctor, the daughter did, to get the assistance, and he wouldn't do it because of the lack of psychiatric and psychological corroboration. Finally, she found a doctor who would write the prescription, and of course, Kate Cheney was dead within the next couple of days. Now, you have to look at that, and you must say, first of all, do safeguards work? I don't think so. Number two, right? You can go doctor shopping. That's what they call it, doctor shopping, to find somebody to do the job, and the pressure can be put on. The second thing is you have to notice that pressure on Kate did not exist before this legislation occurred. She is the victim of a new pressure.
I see.
So let's just call this. Yeah, exactly. So it's this victim, it's a new victim group, and we'll just call it those pressured by family or friends to commit assisted suicide. Whether it be because, the burdens of care are hard, I want some money early, whatever the case may be. It could be nefarious, it could be quasi-innocent, but the fact is a whole new group of victims has been created by this legislation. Is it just? No, it's not, and the bishops are saying it has to be resisted. Let's take a second second group of people. These are the people who are not culpably pressured to die, but they're indirectly pressured to die because of the intimate relationship that they have with people. For example, the son comes in and to the doctor's office. The doctor says, "Oh, your mother's been diagnosed with terminal illness. She has two choices. She can receive a pain protocol, or she could receive aid in dying. Why don't you go and tell your mom about the choices?" Aid in dying, by the way, Henry, that's the name for assisted suicide. So, of course, the son goes in. He talks to the mother. The mother says, "Gee whiz, what do you mean I have an option to take a pain protocol or to commit suicide? What are you saying? I mean, are you indifferent to my suicide? Are you indifferent to my life?" The very thought and the presentation of indifference is, of course, enough to push somebody without religious or philosophical objections to the contrary, push them over the line to an unwanted assisted suicide. Dr. Kathleen Foley, who is a pain and symptom management specialist, has published widely, has worked for many, many prestigious medical institutes, has published on assisted suicide requests, along with my own mentor, Dr. Ed Pellegrino, and has said unequivocally that the vast, vast majority of suicide requests are reversed. The vast majority of them are reversed when pain and depression are treated adequately. And, by the way, in the vast majority of cases, pain and depression can be treated adequately. So there's really no excuse for it. Let me just give a last group of victims. I could go on about this, but the one that's really important are those who are kind of economically challenged. They don't have the money to buy the impressive new insurance policy that will be required. They have to take advantage of a state insurance policy like the Oregon State Health Plan. Now, in this particular case, a woman by the name of Barbara Wagner, who had, one of the cheaper plans, an Oregon State Health Plan, gets a letter after she's been diagnosed with cancer. "Well, we can't do anything for you to help you with your treatment or life-extending procedures. However, we can give you and pay for assistance suicide." At which point Barbara Wagner says, "Hey, they're willing to pay for me to die, but they're not willing to pay for me to live." Now, but the point is, we are bifurcating our insurance policies, right, by doing this. And we're creating two classes of people: those who can get policies that will give life-extending treatments, etc., and those who cannot, for whom there's going to be only one option, and that's going to be aid in dying or assisted suicide. Now, just think of all these victims. Think about the victims who are just reversibly depressed. That means they're temporarily depressed when they get a diagnosis, but they are going to reverse that depression and the suicide request. When you think about the whole new groups of victims, I mean, these new victims groups never existed before the legislation. They far outnumber by 10, 20, 30 times the number of people who would ever want to avail themselves of the option or freedom for assisted suicide. This legislation not only makes no sense for the bishops, it's completely unjust and immoral. And not only that, you're right, Henry, it creates a culture of suicide. At the end of the day, what you're really dealing with when you get down to this issue is what becomes, legislatively sanctioned. That means what becomes legalized becomes normative, and what becomes normal becomes moral. This is a very moral, exactly. So it happens all the time. So you give legal sanction, that is, say you legalize something, then it becomes normal, right? If it becomes normal, people say, "Oh, it must be moral because everybody's doing it."